everyone. Claire Cantro here with Spread the Well. Oh, let me get my video camera. Good. All right. So normally on Mondays around noon, I come to you with my friend Norm, the mental health practitioner, in our little segment that we've dubbed Between Several Lamps. And we talk about different concepts in the pain world and pain management and understanding pain and all of that stuff. He and I could not connect today, but I wanted to do a video today because of something that has been out there in media and kind of circulated and generated in different formats that I really wanted to kind of give my 2 cents on. And that is this New York Times article that came out, and let me read the title of it. That says, most treatments for lower back pain don't really work, study finds. So this is a clickbait title, right? This is a title that drums up you assume I can get everything that is put into this article by just reading the title. And that's actually not the case. But I will say, regardless of that, language like this, and then in response to that, I've seen on a couple of different news outlets, but specifically Good Morning America did about a 3-minute segment in response to this article. And what's hard about this language and these sort of findings that are shared in a very quick, one sentence, way, is that it can be very misleading and it can be very discouraging to a patient population who is already discouraged. And if you've watched any of the things that Norm and I have done, one of my biggest issues with being someone who is trying to be a leader and a front runner in the pain management world is that we have done a huge disservice to patients who fall into the category of what we would consider chronic pain, or what we used to consider chronic pain. And now the different language includes central sensitization, meaning that my central nervous system is now more sensitized and more threatened, and thus more reactive to stimulus, right? Or we use the term kind of in the pain science world, we use the term nociplastic pain, which kind of again blends in that category of chronic pain, central sensitization. The more complex, difficult to treat, don't make sense on paper type of diagnoses. So right off the bat, lower back pain is 2 very separate entities. And to her credit, the lady who was sort of the analyst and the one that was giving the details in the Good Morning America report does at the end kind of come up with hey, you can't look at low back pain the same. One is acute low back pain, one is chronic low back pain, which again, that language is even sort of outdated. And she gives, examples of what you can do to help, which I'll unpack for you guys. The problem with all of this, though, is, we in the pain management world truly understand already that the research is not there, and it is hard because we are trying to take an entity of low back pain and see what's working across the board for these individuals, when in reality, they are 2 separate entities. And I would argue even different entities among those 2 different groups based on diagnoses, based on trauma history, based on all kinds of things. So to populate research, and it's one of the reasons why I have taken issue with research in general, is because I tend to treat patients who don't make sense in the research. I tend to treat patients who are outliers, who will never do well in response to management in the very textbook, protocol-driven, evidence-based way, right? So even with evidence, which is so important, right? And it drives how we look at patients and how we address patients, is missing a huge piece to say, hey, this is going to work for, depending on how good the research and the evidence is, anywhere from 60 to 80% of patients that present with A, B, and C. Well, what about the 20%? What about the 30%? What about the 40% that doesn't work for, right? And so that's the limitation in research, and why I'm hopeful that other practitioners like me exist out there to say, maybe we can be a voice for that outlier group, right? But right off the bat, this sort of language, this most lower back pain treatment doesn't work, is really not helpful, right? And in response to that, I get a text message with the article and a screenshot of some comments from practitioners commenting on the New York Times article. And I would like to read one of those comments. So this is from Robert. I'm a chiro, and for 24 years, I've treated back, neck pain in a multi-specialty practice with spinal manipulation, specific exercise, physical therapy, massage, and a variety of injections. A significant portion of these patients simply aren't willing to do what's necessary to minimize their condition. Smoking, sedentary, unhealthy lifestyles. They want someone to fix them, and sadly, it's not likely. Okay. I would say that is wholly unhelpful as a comment for many reasons. We are putting a blanket statement out there to say that everyone who doesn't get better, it's your fault, right? And Alex comments on Robert's comment. He says, Robert, exactly. Active treatment, yoga, Pilates, core strength is the best way to treat low back pain. You quickly see how important it is to people when they realize that they have to get off the couch and do something. So these are two comments on this article in the New York Times. And I will tell you, I did get emotional about seeing these sort of comments, and I came and commented in response, which I will share as well. But it's these sort of words, this sort of narrative, this sort of unilateral thought process that, and I'm not saying that there should not be accountability and a buy-in from the client and patient about wanting to get better and about wanting to do the things that they can to improve their quality of life, to improve their suffering, to improve their health, right? But the percentage of people that I see with significant, nociplastic, central sensitization, chronic pain, and specifically in this case, chronic low back pain, are not those people. They are healthy. They are extremely active. You look at these individuals, they have 10% body fat, okay? They're doing advanced exercise like Pilates, Legree, F45, or, CrossFit within reason. I give parameters of like, hey, let's avoid this, or like, these patients are not willing to do what's necessary to improve their situation. So wholly unhelpful is comments like this from Robert and Alex. My comment to them was, hi, Robert, your comment represents everything that is wrong about how we collectively mismanaged chronic low back pain and nociplastic pain, and why there are patients who are suffering not only with pain that doesn't seem to respond appropriately to mainstream evidence-based treatment modalities like the ones you listed as your practice model, but also with a healthcare system that makes them feel like they are the problem. Your sentiments are a huge part of why we have a pain epidemic, an opioid crisis, and people at breaking point, which is a complete reference to the gentleman who was the shooter in the United Healthcare CEO situation. And if you watched his story. He shared his entire story about how his chronic pain and then the burden of the financial aspect of his chronic pain made him go mad, made him go absolutely crazy. I do not condone that as a reason for violence of any nature, but it is an added narrative in the pain epidemic, right? The pain epidemic is not just the opioid crisis. That's a huge part of it. The pain epidemic is the fact that we, as a healthcare system and in the medical model, do not understand pain, and we are not going to bat for our patients, okay? And I go on to say this article is a perfect microcosm of just how much we don't understand pain, not even medical providers treating pain for 25 years, to quote him. I want to unpack, and I just took a screenshot of the end of the segment where the lady is in the GMA segment where they're sort of unpacking what you can do, right? So after this very discouraging, most studies show that nothing really helps lower back pain. But here's what you can do. If you have acute low back pain, she says you can do NSAIDs. NSAIDs, that's it. This is a medical doctor, a cardiologist, I believe, who is a GMA specialist analyst on all things medicine, which I get it. But I would say, in addition to NSAIDs, there is a lot more that you can do for acute low back pain than just medicine. And the fact that we are still talking about it in this way and saying you can do NSAIDs, and that should help get you out of your acute low back episode, that's the problem, right? We are already a model and a hierarchy in the medical world that assumes that medicine and or surgeries and or quick fixes or whatever are going to help us, right? And so to me, this is, you can probably see that this is upsetting and frustrating to me. When someone reaches out to me, so I have clients, I have wellness clients that I treat, and sometimes they'll reach out with their own issue or an issue for a loved one of theirs and said, oh, you know, so-and-so did too much yard work. Their back is just truly spasming. They just feel that acute, sharp, you know, type of protective response. What should we do? And it's often, should we do heat or should we go to the doctor? And I would say no to either of those things. And I'm going to make the point also to say that I am not against seeing a medical doctor. But here's what I would say. Unless your back pain started because you had a massive fall or a violent accident, you got hit by a car, you got something major happened where you might need to go in and get imaging to make sure that we don't have a gross instability or a fracture or something that would indicate a different path, right? But if you're just out in the yard, you know, doing something, or you lift something funny, or you slept funny, or whatever it is, and you're having this significant response that sometimes doesn't match what we did, right? Doesn't match the mechanism of injury. Again, we have a thought process that we need to break, that the amount of pain we're experiencing is equal to the amount of tissue damage that we have, okay? We have got to forget that we ever bought into that. The amount of pain that you have, even in an acute situation, has everything to do with your nervous system alarm and your nervous system's interpretation of how threatening something is. And that is why we get this protective response, right? I can go out in my yard and I can bend over too much, or I can lift something heavy, and what can be happening in my tissue, which is maybe some muscle strain, So muscle strain is some of the fibers in my muscles tear, not a complete rupture, not a complete tear, but they are inflamed. Or just like when we go work out, we have delayed onset muscle soreness and we get lactic acid built up in the tissue, which creates, pain and soreness. Or I can have a ligament sprain. We are loaded with ligament and connective tissue throughout our spine and our sacrum and our back. And so if I'm doing something much like I sprain my ankle, right? If I go out of the range that my ligaments are have an understanding of, or if I do too much repetitive activity and my ligaments get kind of strained and overworked and overused, and I have inflammation, so sprain, meaning, again, some of the ligament fibers are torn, not a complete rupture, but just enough to create some inflammatory response and those sort of things. But generally, when people have really significant acute low back pain, what they're actually feeling is this mass protective response. So the muscles around the ligaments and the spine segments and whatnot are starting to spasm, okay? And every time we go to move or do something, I go to bend forward, I go to get up out of a chair, we're getting that kind of seizing protective response. That is not how severe your sprain is. That is not how severe your strain is. What that is, or that's not an indication that you have a disc herniation. There are certain symptoms that fall into that category. But this sort of response is generally this dominant muscular system or neuromuscular system that we have in place that is protecting us, right? So if you can start to visualize that protective response does not indicate how severe this injury is, but how protective your body is being, and that the most important thing that you can do in that moment is to down-regulate or dampen that protective response, then you are starting to understand pain. Then you are giving yourself a gift of the future of what we can do to counter this nervous system driven protective response. So, do I say avoid NSAIDs in that acute low back space? No. But we're not just doing NSAIDs, because if I don't dampen and address that nervous system or neuromuscular response, and I just use NSAIDs and we finally get it to kind of calm down, I have not actually shown the tissue that it does not have to be so reactive. And so what the interpretation becomes in my nervous system is, I did good. I protected you, right? So now that the inflammation is gone and the threat is gone, but what's happened now is my nervous system has become increased in protective response. So my nervous system has become sensitized to whatever happened in my low back. And the next time it happens, the response is going to be as big or robust or even more, okay? So what we can do in this acute intervention, in addition to NSAIDs, is I love ice. Ice and heat are very, they're all over the place. But what I find in a nervous system, in an effort to dampen a nervous system response, ice is great. Heat, although it can feel good, we're also creating a dilating effect. So we're getting more infiltration of inflammatory just that inflammatory fluids that can become more protective and reactive. Ice can be a nervous system dampener. It can kind of shut off that protective response by kind of numbing the situation. The other thing is I take a tennis ball, lacrosse ball, trigger point therapy ball of any kind, and I put pressure in those super reactive areas until the spasms cease, okay? It can be extremely painful. It can be extremely, and we want to protect more, but that is the only way. And if you've heard videos that I've done before about trigger point release or spasm release, the goal is, or dry needling, right? It's the same concept, is I'm going into a very hyperactive situation and I'm putting pressure, and in that immediate response, we're going to get more reactivity. It's going to get more protective, but eventually the ATP and the energy of those muscle cells will run out and that muscle will fatigue. When that happens, the muscle relaxes and then will sort of reinstate a more productive link tension in that musculature. Okay, so the best thing for you, this is my interpretation. I am not deep in research, but I am very anecdotal. I'm a very intuitive practitioner, and I am a very good practitioner in terms of addressing pain. That is the best thing that you can do to dampen that nervous system response. That doesn't mean NSAIDs won't work, but what you can do in that situation is you can help your future self by letting your nervous system know that it does not have to be so protective all the time, okay? So that's my tidbit. The other thing that the lady alludes to is on the chronic pain side, which I would say, the diagnosis of chronic low back pain, CLBP, sorry, I get a little dyslexic, is we have come to understand that this is no longer an acute orthopedic myofascial musculoskeletal issue. This is a nociplastic, falls under the category of nociplastic pain, of central sensitization, and cannot be handled in the same way you handle acute low back pain. And in fact, why we have chronic low back pain is probably because we have mismanaged acute low back pain for so long that our nervous systems are now so sensitized and so ramped up and so ready to protect us with anything involving our low back, okay? So what she offers, the 5 things that she offers for chronic low back pain is to try exercise, spinal manipulation, taping, and she says, what were the other, I forget exactly what she alludes to, because the other things that she talks about is, but the most important take-home message and the best thing that you can do is prevention of low back pain episodes and maintaining a healthy weight. Okay, so let me also say that spinal manipulation doesn't just include what chiropractors do. Physical therapists, other body workers are trained in joint mobilizations, high velocity manipulations like getting the pop. I would also argue that trigger point myofascial techniques around the spine are another additional aspect of spinal manipulation. Of course, in the literature, it's going to be much more specific. And of course, exercise, that is the crux of, what physical therapy is founded on, is corrective, functional, therapeutic exercise, right? As a pain practitioner and as someone who comes at patients from a very intentional nervous system driven place, you cannot exercise yourself through pain, okay? And in fact, if we exercise through pain, oftentimes our body is going to change a movement pattern to avoid pain. And what we end up doing is exercising and strengthening an abnormal movement pattern. That's not always the case, because there are great exercises, there's great therapeutic techniques, there's great postural endurance exercises that can be super beneficial for pain and nervous system dampening, nervous system regulation. But in the offhand way that we assume, so I don't want to use, but a loved one of mine has this idea that when he injures himself, what he needs to do is go back and get in the gym, right? And that is not always the case. And that's a mentality, again, that sets us up for more pain, more funky movement patterns, more poor posturing, more pain down the line, right? So I will say those two things. The other thing that I will say is and this is how I tell patients, and I can use myself as an example. My weight has fluctuated for my entire adult life. If I'm carrying 5 extra pounds, 10 extra pounds, 40 extra pounds, that is going to play onto my body and my system, and that's going to make things harder for me. But overweight does not equal pain. You are not in pain because you're overweight. Do I say that again? You are not in pain because you are overweight. Maybe it doesn't help the situation. Maybe we can look into how fat cells are pro-inflammatory and can create a network of increased inflammation in your body, which of course contributes to more pain. But there are plenty of very overweight people that exist in our world that are not in pain. There are plenty of people in extreme pain, chronic pain, who are suffering, who are not overweight. Okay, so we need to take apart all of that. I am a huge believer in overall health and taking care of our bodies. I'm also a huge believer in the biggest missing part of our physical health is our mental and emotional health, okay? Because you are not going to convince someone to move and just do better and make better choices and manage their stress better and all of those things, eat healthier when they are dysregulated, okay? So I'm getting off on a tangent. I felt that it was very important to address this article, the discussion about this article. I will post in the comments the link to the GMA thing and a link to the New York Times article. If you have a login, you can access it. But this is a perfect example of why we need to do better, okay? When I am managing my chronic pain patients, so just to go back to what she came up with, the 5, I love that they threw taping in there because taping is a beautiful way to help facilitate a biofeedback in a productive way. But guess what it's doing? It is targeting your nervous system. It's targeting your neuromuscular system, okay? I would say to just throw exercise out there, but without saying, hey, certain exercises for chronic low back pain are way more important and way more effective than the exercises you're thinking. Oh, they alluded to core strengthening, right? Go back to my videos. They're on my YouTube channel about how your core is not your abs, right? We've got to do better about language. You can't throw out there that exercise is the only way you're going to get yourself out of chronic low back pain when that is not the case. Truly, and they also listed antidepressants, which thank God, right? Because nowhere in acute low back pain and chronic low back pain does opioids exist as a beneficial help to getting yourself out of pain. So in an acute situation, NSAID, so it's likely inflammatory in nature, and anti-inflammatories help. In chronic low back pain, it has nothing to do with your tissue. You know what helps the most? Anti-anxiety and antidepressant medication, because it is about your nervous system. Okay, so I probably have much more to say on this, but I felt really empowered to share this with you guys and to start trying to create a rebuttal to the things that are put out there, or to give you hope about your situation when things are shared that are really not helpful. So I do hope this helps, and thank you for listening and watching my videos.